Hello, and welcome to another Wheel of Time diary where I am dressed a lot more fancy than I typically am for these videos, but that's because I accidentally, will say, unintentionally lied in yesterday's State of Affairs video saying I would record this video on Wednesday, the 2nd of October. Instead, I decided that I'm just going to get it done right now on Tuesday, the 1st of October, because I'm actually feeling fresh enough to get it through, and because I have time to, and because, well, I might as well. There's holding it over a day won't really do anything to help this video, so we'll just kind of work through it. Lord of Chaos definitely started with a bang last week. I got through a decent bit of it, about 120-ish pages if I'm not mistaken, and I enjoyed quite a bit of it. I only had a couple very minor complaints overall. I have one correction that I'll have to make coming into the spoiler section of this video, but I enjoyed myself. This week I've gotten a good bit further into the book. You'll see I'm almost halfway through. I'm actually a couple chapters ahead of schedule. In order to make sure that I finish this book on time, I've been needing to read right around 120 pages every week. I read about 140 pages this week. Spent, what if I'm not mistaken, it was right around 9 hours reading this week. Yeah, I read about for 9 hours this week compared to just under 8 hours last week. So definitely a little bit extra time spent there, and basically everything that I read this week was also pretty good. I've definitely been into it. That's going to be the trend. Been seeing some really fun things happen. It's definitely been paced very good overall as well. Given that this is, like, I believe I mentioned this in the last video, I'm not 100% sure. Given that this is also the longest book in the Wheel of Time alongside The Shadow Rising, they're just a few thousand words apart, basically. I did have slight reservations for this one, wondering if, you know, the length of it might get in its own way at times. Like I felt like was sort of partially the case for The Shadow Rising. I didn't feel like that one was as tight as the first 3 books were, so I was slightly disappointed by a couple aspects with that one in that regard. But it's definitely proving me wrong. I haven't really had any issues with the pacing or with the POV allocations stuff so far. I mean, there's a couple plot lines that haven't really appeared on the page yet, but I can see them actually coming together. I think this is supposed to be a very Rand focused book in the first place anyway, so I'm not super concerned with where the side or the other characters, will say, are at the moment. But either way, let's kind of talk about what actually happened. So this is going to be jumping into the spoilers, I suppose. I should clarify, I read chapters 6 through 15 this week, so if you have not read through that, you should probably not continue on. But let's go ahead and jump into it. I was actually did not have enough time because of all the videos that I recorded last weekend to actually compile my notes and my memory of reading the chapters to actually make like my normal chapter by chapter thoughts as I would post them in Discord. So sorry to Discord friends who didn't get to see any of those reactions. I DM'd a couple of the reactions of them specifically to like Reen, but overall didn't actually post anything in any fantasy or Wheel of Time channels in any of the servers I'm in. But I do have the notes of what actually happened because of the new note-taking format that I'm trying to follow, so I do have something to base this off of. Otherwise I would have basically no memory of what happened because my brain's kind of been in a fog the last month. Either way, chapter 6, it turned out that finishing after chapter 5 last week was a great stopping spot because chapter 6 returns once again to being another Forsaken POV. This time it is of Samael meeting with Graendal in Aradoman. And actually, before I continue onward, that correction that I had to make, someone did comment on last week's video. Thank you for clarifying this, saying that I was actually mistaken, saying that Miss Ayana was a Black Aja. She's not an Aes Sedai. She's not Black Aja. She just happens to have been infiltrating the White Tower to some degree. She is Forsaken, not necessarily an Aes Sedai. That was a mistake or a misunderstanding on my part because, like, the kind of implication in here, at least in the prologue, was that she was Black Aja, just kind of working directly with the Forsaken or more directly. So that was my misinterpretation, having forgotten her name as being one of the Forsaken, so it was just kind of a disconnect there. So that's my bad, misremembering and misinterpreting that. But overall, basically the details of everything else that I said last week still apply. But like I said, chapter 6 begins with Samael meeting with Graendal in Eredomand. Graendal tells Samael of what Demandred said to them, basically, in their meeting from the prologue, of what the Dark One told him, which was the very first scene of the prologue. So Samael considers, some of the distrust of the Forsaken throughout this exchange, his distrust with some of the Forsaken, the fact that he and Graendal talk, but like most of them don't really trust each other that much, but the others just met, but there's like a lot of like subliminal political stuff going on between the Forsaken, which is actually kind of a nice thing, because if all the Forsaken were to just band together and be super trusting with each other, they could destroy Rand and everybody else probably pretty easily. So the fact that there is a lot of like questioning here is great. But I also just want to note that in this thing, Graendal telling Samael what Demandred told her doesn't actually tell us, the reader, anything, because Robert Jordan is very wont to do this thing where he says, oh yeah, they exchanged this information that we were never given, so we're left to kind of guess and wonder at what some of that stuff was. So that's an interesting note. We also get a little brief POV switch in the middle of the chapter to Graendal after Samael takes off, I believe, if I'm not mistaken anyway, where basically get the idea that Graendal does not like Samael, and it seems like this is kind of the feeling between all of the Forsaken with each other. She's also convinced that he will die in Ilion against Rand. She thinks he's being hard-headed and stupid for just kind of waiting there instead of choosing to do something else about it. Letting them run to him seems like a foolish decision in her mind. She also has her own plots going on from the rest of the Forsaken as well, that she kind of just thinks about in her head, plots that we, the reader, are similarly not really given. But we essentially have the understanding that all of these Forsaken are like sort of working together, but also definitely not. They all have their own plots, they all have their own goals and their own plans. They're basically just working for the Dark One to whatever degree suits them, or rather suits their standing with the Dark One, and like that's it. So whatever trust goes elsewhere doesn't really matter to them. They don't tend to trust other people. Another scene in chapter 6 that I was actually rather disturbed by, relatively speaking, it's one of the more disturbing scenes in the series so far, was Semirhage torturing an Aes Sedai and her warder for information of interest to the Fade from the prologue, Shaidar Haran. I believe I pronounced that correctly, but I probably didn't, which also happens to be information that the Dark One would be privy to, or want to be privy to anyway. She ponders the Fade and the standings of the other Forsaken. I believe this is probably the first POV or anything we've really gotten on the page of Semirhage, besides the references that like the other Forsaken especially in this book already have made in accordance with her not making it to the meeting with Graendal and Demandred and, you know, all of that fancy nonsense. So a lot of interesting, like I said, subliminal political stuff going on with the Forsaken that has been the biggest highlight of this chapter, and probably the biggest highlight of the book aside from Rand's stuff. And maybe, you know, Matt kind of coming into his own, but Matt's only had the one chapter so far, so it's kind of saying a lot. But there's been more of the Forsaken between the prologue and this one chapter than there was for Matt. Moving into chapters 7 and 8, we get a little bit of an Elaine and Nynaeve plot line where the two of them gather with Swan and Leanne and 6 other Aes Sedai in Tel'aran'rhiod to investigate the goings-on of the towers. So Elaine has been rather successful in making several ter'angreal that are able to help the Aes Sedai, and even, you know, Swan and Leanne, who can no longer touch the source, are no longer Aes Sedai because of being stilled, enter Tel'aran'rhiod and do stuff there. This chapter was pretty tense, politically speaking, because of all of the little tiny hints and droplets of information that the women get through searching through Elida's study in the White Tower, the little flitting or, you know, fleeting sheets of information and letters and notes and other stuff like that that kind of come and go in Tel'aran'rhiod. Leanne suddenly goes elsewhere near the beginning of this chapter as well, and Nynaeve is made to follow her. So there's something interesting of note going on here, most likely agreed upon and known by both Siuan and Leanne, that Leanne is doing here, but that like none of the other characters know. I'm interested to see if that comes up and becomes an important point later. I'm sure it will, but it definitely hasn't yet. Nynaeve will cover in just a little bit when we're talking about chapter 8. For the rest of chapter 7, we remain in Elaine's POV, where, like I said, they're searching through Elida's study. Evidence is found of Elida sending emissaries to Rand in Caemlyn. Elaine's mother is apparently noted to either possibly be anywhere or dead or basically anything. There's no certainty on what the status of Morgase is, according to the letters that Elida has in her study, and the status of various different wars throughout the world, wars, civil wars, skirmishes, stuff like in what's the country that Tanchi goes in, Terabon, and then also stuff in the borderlands, the Northern Territories, is stuff that is briefly hinted at and expanded upon in the chapter, but not to any significant degree. That's just some of the stuff that they find. But then suddenly in the middle of the chapter, many of the Aes Sedai and the women are trapped in a literal nightmare. Nightmare made real in Tel'aran'rhiod, because these Aes Sedai are not very good at keeping their thoughts reserved and to themselves, so their thoughts kind of manifest. At least this is my understanding of it. Their thoughts manifest to some degree in Tel'aran'rhiod, so like the nightmares become like actual things that entrap them. And apparently the best way to stop a nightmare is to convince yourself and basically tell yourself it's not real, it can't do anything to you, and it like kind of goes away. But the size of this nightmare in this particular chapter is so big that Siuan and Elaine can't really do anything else besides enter it themselves and convince all the other women to believe strong enough with them that it can't hurt them. And right before basically all of them die, essentially, because if they die in Tel'aran'rhiod, they die in the real world. Haha. Yeah, they very nearly die before the nightmare disappears. So that was a pretty tense and interesting scene there. Following this encounter, all the Aes Sedai decide to leave. Siuan decides to stay, so presumably for something related to why Leanne went off a different direction. I'm presuming that she probably went off to meet with her there. Elaine agrees to come out of Tel'aran'rhiod with the other women, even though she wants to follow Siuan. But before waking up, she does choose to go to her mother's palace in Caemlyn very briefly before returning awake, where it just so happens that Demandred is also in the palace in Tel'aran'rhiod and sees her there. So there's some interesting questions going on there. It's kind of strange that Demandred just happened to be there, question mark. So who knows really what's going on there. In chapter 8, we come to, find Nynaeve wandering about in Tel'aran'rhiod, being unable to find Leanne, and she just wakes up in Saladar, and turns out she woke up after literally everybody else, so it turns out that her searching was for nothing, which she knew was going to be the case, but she wasn't going to argue with the Aes Sedai at this point. But in the main body of the chapter, Nynaeve wanders about Saladar in a pretty sour mood, which is pretty typical for her, let's be honest. She's also intent on studying Siuan for healing. This is a point that was made especially in the prologue, but is made especially more so here in my reading for this week. Theodrin is also intent on breaking Nynaeve's little magic barrier block thing that she has, literally described as a block, the block that requires her to be angered to be able to channel. Theodrin just really wants to break the block so that Nynaeve will be able to channel at any point without necessarily having to be very angry. But Nynaeve tries learning how to detect a male using magic from Moghedien in this chapter as well. Having searched about for Elaine and not having found her, Elaine bursts in with news of an emissary from Elida and the White Tower reaching Saladar. That is how that chapter ends. Pretty tense stuff. So we're left on, a little bit of a cliffhanger until a little bit later. It is chapters 12 and 13. It looks like that continues on this plot line, so we'll just pick up there real quick. Moghedien suggests for Nynaeve and Elaine to make for Rand in Caemlyn, which is an idea that I believe it is Nynaeve really wants to do. Nynaeve inquires after this because she talks with Birgit about the possibility of doing such a thing, about the possibility of also acquiring horses so that they can leave Saladar, and also about avoiding telling Uno any of this, because Nynaeve very well knows that Uno will follow them, and she doesn't really want him to follow them for whatever reason. Nynaeve is summoned in the middle of the chapter by a couple of the Aes Sedai called Janya and Denala, I believe is how they're pronounced. She's questioned about Rand, which apparently she's questioned about Rand a lot because she grew up with Rand and she doesn't really have any new information to tell. They desperately want for her to give more information that she apparently doesn't have. Immediately after this grilling of sorts, Nynaeve heads to Theodrin for more lessons on trying to break her block. She winds up eavesdropping in the end of the chapter, however, on Tarna, who is the emissary from the White Tower here in Saladar, who's having a meeting with the other Aes Sedai in the hall, coming to a standstill, basically saying, yeah, we're not necessarily going to come back to the tower. We need more time to make a decision, so tell Elaida that we need more time to make a decision, basically. Nynaeve overhears this. Chapter 13 is talking about Theodrin's attempts to undo Nynaeve's block remaining unsuccessful, is basically the bulk of that chapter. Elaine complains to Nynaeve about her day. The two of them argue about whether or not to leave Caemlyn, so a point taken from a little bit earlier, you know, especially given, you know, Moghedien suggesting that they should actually go and find Rand themselves. Elaine would technically be queen here, even though Morghese is alive. Nobody really knows that for sure. Elaine could be queen, and they would be there for Rand. But ultimately they decide not to do that because Nynaeve reveals her having eavesdropped on the others. They decide ultimately, like I said, to not go to Caemlyn. They feel like it would actually do more harm than good as far as the goal of making sure that Rand tries to trust these groups of the Aes Sedai here in Saladar as opposed to the tower, because, well, Elaida and the tower probably don't have good intentions with Rand. In the middle of this conversation, Tarna happens to randomly appear, intensely enough, and talks with Nynaeve about joining her to the tower, which I'm not entirely sure I understand the reasoning behind this, but it was a tense scene, having Nynaeve basically decide whether or not to do it, but Nynaeve said it wouldn't be right for me to do that. Like, if the others have made their decision not to go, I have no reason to go right now, essentially. So she does that. So, yeah, Elaine and Nynaeve search Tel'aran'rhiod as well that night for something to convince the Hall to support Rand, because, like I said, they eventually decide in this argument that maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. They decide that if they find something to help the tower support Rand, they will stay, but if they don't, then they will go. So, like, there's something going on. In this chapter, however, they find a bull in Ebu Dar, which starts off a relatively infamous plotline in the series that, you know, didn't start off bad. I'm definitely liking where it could be going. Not sure how it would continue or in what ways or how long it could possibly take. I'm not really concerned or worried about it either way. I just thought it was rather funny because I kind of forgot that, you know, any of the infamous plot lines exist in the book, because some of them you just kind of hear about secondhand. It's impossible to avoid, and the Bulls plot line is definitely one of those plot lines. I forgot the plotline existed until I finished reading this chapter. I was like, oh yeah, that is a thing, isn't it? But yeah, so that is going to cover, well, is that going to cover what's in here? Yeah, that is. I'm going to move on to chapters 14 and 15 for now because they kind of intersect just a tiny bit, and then I'll go back and cover a few of the earlier chapters that I skipped for the moment. In chapters 14 and 15 are Egwene's POV, so her first POV since she got very heavily injured in the Fires of Heaven. Because in Tel'aran'rhiod, when Nynaeve and Elaine went there to search for something to help, you know, these Aes Sedai and Saladar to support Rand, they happened to see Egwene there. They just happened to show up where Egwene was, and this chapter starts with Egwene's POV, her disappearing, because she also saw them, but wanted them to think that she wasn't fully there, that she wasn't like actually in Tel'aran'rhiod. So like, whatever stuff like that is going on. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. Either way, Egwene snaps away from seeing Elaine and Nynaeve in Tel'aran'rhiod. She instead, where she snaps away to is basically a dream walking spot, where she's not really in Tel'aran'rhiod. She's just dream walking, kind of noticing various different people's dreams that kind of exists. She winds up getting sucked into Gawain's dream, trying to profess a love for her. He has to defeat Rand as well to free her in this dream, which is kind of strange. Egwene has a very tough time escaping from the dream, which is revealed in the next chapter to be because of very strong extreme love or extreme hate can sometimes cause people to be unable to snap away from dreams that they are observing. And then in the next chapter, Egwene just straight up asks the wise ones about dreams and about dream walking and some of these kinds of things. She avoids admitting what she's been doing going into Tel'aran'rhiod. The reason why she didn't really want anybody to know is because essentially of her injury. She hasn't been able to really do anything, and entering Tel'aran'rhiod and stuff, I guess, is mentally taxing to a degree that it could, like, take issue with her healing or something like that. I don't know the exact rules for it. I understand it, but I don't know how to explain it. Like I said earlier about something else, it doesn't really matter ultimately. All we know is that Egwene asks the wise ones about some of these things she has questions about because of her dreams the night before, or lack thereof, depending on how you see them, being stuck in somebody else's dreams. So she's able to ask those questions without, cluing them into the fact that she's been dream walking or any of those things. But yeah, that's basically where, if I'm not mistaken, where Egwene's stuff ends. Very brief material so far. The other material in chapters 14 and 15 are back to Nynaeve and Elaine, most notably with the end of 14, where a bubble of evil rises in Saladar, and Anaya, one of the Aes Sedai, links with Elaine and Nynaeve and several of the other women around the town to stop the destruction. So that was a pretty good scene, actually. I really enjoyed that one. And then in chapter 15, Elaine and Nynaeve watch as Tarna makes to return for Tarvalon, having not gotten a straight answer from the Aes Sedai here in Saladar. They also make fools of themselves, the girls do, asking Sheriam and the other Aes Sedai for leave to go to Abu Dar to search for this bull so that they can somehow use it to convince them to go with Rand or to side with Rand instead of doing anything with the tower. So that was a funny moment. Sheriam and the rest seem to be finally relenting where Rand is concerned, but maybe not in the way we would like. So we'll see how all of that stuff goes. But let's jump back to chapters 9 through 11, which are the chapters that I haven't covered up to this point. Chapter 9 is pretty simple. It's another POV from Captain Niall, and that's the way that I'm going to pronounce his name, of the White Cloaks. He gets bad information from his ostensible spy master and better info from his actual spy master. Interesting political stuff going on with him and his character and these other two characters here. Niall's resolve to see Rand taken out and Morghese supporting his cause to retake Caemlyn is definitely pretty high, is the main thing that we get out of this chapter. But then we also get a little bit about Morghese trying to play along without playing too much along from her POV, trying to make Captain Niall happy without fully investing in him. I guess that's not the right way to put it, but you kind of probably understand what I mean. There's political tension going on with these two characters, given that Morghese very obviously is going to want to return to Caemlyn, especially since she doesn't know if her daughter's alive, and whether or not, if she happens to not be alive, if Rand is responsible in any way, shape, or form for it. So that's definitely cause for concern. I don't like Niall. The more that we get from his POV, the more icky he kind of feels to me. But moving into chapters 10 and 11, we return once again to some Rand POV material. Rand learns of Aes Sedai staying in Caemlyn, and really great stuff happens in these two chapters, let me tell you what. Bashir is the one that basically reveals this info to him, and so takes him to the inn where these supposed Aes Sedai are staying so that Rand can confront them just like straight up, like, hey, you're in my city, what are you doing here, or whatever else he plans to say to them. It turns out that there are a bunch of Two Rivers girls at the inn, and that is because they have been accompanying themselves with Viren and Alana towards the White Tower to be taken as novices, basically, so that they can train, because apparently not only does the Two Rivers somehow incredibly and so rarely have 3 Taverin associated with them between Rand and Mat and Perrin, they also have a ton of girls that are very capable of very strong power over the One Power, not just with Egwene and Nynaeve, but also with, you know, all these other girls who are being taken to the White Tower for novices. But yeah, so there's a bunch of Two Rivers girls at the inn. Rand talks to them, and, you know, they tell him some of their stories, especially hinting at the fact that Perrin is now the Lord of the Two Rivers, so that is fun. But Rand reveals essentially that the tower is split, actually, and he speaks with the Aes Sedai, Viren and Alana, and ends up, you know, being taken to another room, tells them about this. They kind of have, well, no conversation at all, really, because Alana just decides to bond Rand to her. So Rand is now Alana's warder. Did not see that coming. What a twist. Definitely didn't see that coming. And then while he's leaving the inn, you know, kind of in his bad state of mind, it winds up scaring all of the rest of the girls to high heaven when he is actually outed as being the Dragon Reborn, because he kind of avoided this until, you know, he wound up talking to the Aes Sedai, and his companions like Bashir reveal that he's the Dragon Reborn. So now they're terrified of him. He feels like it's a good thing, because the further away they are from him, the safer they are, probably, in his mind. But I still felt bad about the scared little girls, man. Either way, chapter 11 has a little bit of Viren and Alana discussing about Alana's having bonded Rand, especially without asking him. Apparently that's kind of a taboo thing for Aes Sedai to do. There's also a little bit about some of the other information that they're kind of learning. Viren uses some of her knowledge to manipulate Alana a bit, though we're not 100% sure in what ways, kind of whichever direction they're going to go towards, you know, the Aes Sedai rebels, so to speak, or the tower or whatever, and how they're going to work with Rand is still in question. But I'm pretty sure Viren is, I would hope, still in some good standing to some degree with like Swan and Leanne. So I would presume that these two are going to wind up getting Rand closer to the side in Saladar, but no guarantees there, of course. Then we return once again to Rand's POV, where he returns to the farm where he has all the other men being tested and trained for the One Power. While here, Rand cuts a deal with Taim, because Taim genuinely feels like he's able to make a bigger difference if he's able to actively search around for people to test and train with the One Power. Taim is now basically tasked with the goal of going out and searching, like I said, for men to channel on his own, having been taught how to make gateways and stuff by Rand. He's also under a promise of taking, you know, very short amount of time compared to what Rand wants, with men coming to him and his amnesty, searching for his amnesty, and then being tested and trained, and then, you know, just the amount of training time it would take anyway to just gather a bunch of people with time going anywhere and everywhere as quickly as possible, and then gathering them and training them, as opposed to, like I said, having them come to him and then be trained. Rand doesn't have that long before the last battle in the Dark One rises to have a whole army of men, so he finally relents and allows time to do this thing. I suspect there might be well, unsavory consequences to this action at some point in time. I'm not sure how severe those consequences could be, but that is something to note. I think my rambles in this video were terrible. I don't think anything that I said made very much sense, probably because I didn't actually write any substantial notes for my chapter thoughts in this video. Basically just wrote down the very basic outlines of what actually happened. So I apologize if this video is pretty rough, but yeah, I moved through quite a bit of information. I was able to talk about it a little bit quicker than I was able to talk about last week's reading, so I hope that that worked out fine. I'm fully invested in the book. It's definitely taking a long time to read, but I'm been able to read quite a bit of it. Just as long as I keep on schedule, I'm going to continue to be happy with it. And as for the content itself, it's definitely heading in a lot of interesting directions. I suppose that a couple of the other main characters, you know, some of the other plot lines from the prologue, especially that haven't really appeared on the page yet, are probably going to appear soon-ish, such as like Zareen and Perrin. Something with them has got to happen on the page here at some point. I would presume so. It would be kind of weird for them to go this entire book as well, without being on the page besides in the prologue, so I'm sure that that's something we're going to see more of, but not sure when that's going to happen or to what degree any of that's going to take place. I'm just invested in all the different plot lines right now. Sometimes it's hard to differentiate characters and remember which Aes Sedai or which Aes Sedai. I'm definitely seeing that complaint a lot more now. There are apparently a lot of Aes Sedai that I should recognize from past books that I'm having trouble recognizing. It's also part of the reason I mistook the one Forsaken last week for an Aes Sedai then, which got corrected. It's because there are just a lot of names being dumped, and my understanding is that with Aes Sedai especially, that's going to get worse. So I'm pretty nervous about that, because there are definitely many of the named Aes Sedai through my reading this week are, you know, ones that I've known of, and I can remember them. I just don't remember them specifically until I've had a little bit of time and like read their name a few times. I'm just like, okay, I recognize that name, but I'm not 100% sure I fully remember that character or what it is they may have said or done in some of the past books. And to be fair, none of them have been really major characters for the most part. The major characters I remember well enough, but a lot of the, you know, tangential secondary characters, tertiary characters even, have been a little bit more of a struggle for me, so we'll see how that goes moving forward. Either way, that is the end of this video. I'll be back next week with another one of these diaries with however much I get read this weekend. I'm going to try to get even more ahead on the book if I can, to future-proof myself in case I end up getting behind on reading in future weeks. I very nearly got behind on my reading this week, but managed to make time to catch it back up because, well, the more I get behind, the earlier, the worse it would end up being later. So I'm getting ahead now. But like I said, I'll be back next week for another one of these for whatever chapters I end up reading, for more incoherent and terrible ramblings, I'm sure. But thank you for watching. If you did, I'll be back in the next video and hope to see you there.